afternoon. Welcome to this edition of the Citizens Chat Show on Civic Space TV. I am Phillip Muliisa. Today, the Citizens Chat Show takes the conversation to the continent. We want to assess Africa's chance against fighting the global economic architecture, and we have a background of the IDA 21 summit that happened 2 days ago in Nairobi, Kenya. Now joining me on that conversation is a panel of distinguished citizens of this country, whom I will introduce, starting from my extreme left, from Uganda People's Congress, the Honorable Ochieno Joseph. Honorable, good afternoon and welcome back from that Labor Day holiday.
It's a pleasure to be back here, but I wasn't really on a holiday. I was burying the dead, of the 4 people I buried within the last 10 days. 3 of them quite clearly died from...
You work for funeral service?
No, I'm a responsible Ugandan citizen. Of course, Uganda People's Congress, every citizen matters to all of us. But the funeral service is actually quite busy. You're absolutely right. I saw one setting up in Tororo, and we were just discussing it with my nieces last night. But the point is that, yes, people are dying, and of the 3 deaths of the 4, 3 of them are very basic deaths, including a 2-month-old child who died yesterday as I was leaving Lagonga, actually from the Jamwa family. So it's a mess, hence the import of this conversation.
Welcome back from those events, and with our condolences to you and the families that lost their loved ones. Next to Honorable Ochieno is Professor Mwabutsya Ndebesa. He's a political analyst and a professor of political history. Professor, you most welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. And good afternoon to the viewers out there.
Thank you. Next professor is an economist from CYESA Uganda, CYESA Africa, Mr. Wotsomu Wanda. What a name. You most welcome to the show.
Yeah, good evening viewers. Wotsomu Wanda from Eastern Uganda, Masaba. So Wotsomu is my grandfather's name, as our elders here were talking.
We are dominated by Eastern Uganda today.
The land of the wise.
The land of the wise.
Are you surprised?
But they have never provided a president for Uganda.
Or presidency is some sort of, you have to be this group of people. Either NRA or something, and we are not part of that.
No, we push this. So therefore, we are going to provide leadership in the future. Once Africa sorts out its economic messes and its space, and Africans begin to think constructively using their brains and minds, then the East will be providing not only the leadership in terms of thinking, but also, yes, the vision.
That is your justification and consolation.
All of the cream will rise.
That is your consolation.
Thank you so much.
Professor, just telling us we can dream on.
Lastly on the show is Dr.Robert Ojambo from Kyambogo University, the head of the Department of Political Science and History. Doctor, you most welcome to the show, and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, viewers, and thank you, Filippo.
Thank you. Now, gentlemen, fortunately, we have an all-male panel today. However, our viewers are well aware that behind the machines we have more ladies out there, and they're making things run here. So, taking the conversation to the continent, and we're discussing the economics of Africa, I want to start with you, Professor Mwabutsya Ndebesa. Every time the economics of Africa come up in relation to the entire world, we talk about many things. Among them is institutions like the World Bank, institutions like IMF. We talk about the rich countries of the world, United States, European countries, UK, Germany, and so on. But historically, what is the economy of Africa as a people?
Thank you for that question. These days we talk about knowledge economy. In the past, economists used to tell us there was a comparative advantage where each nation or each people would specialize in something they are endowed with naturally. And that is why they were fond of this comparative advantage, because geographically we are endowed with different resources. But as time went on, and especially under capitalism, I think we would rather talk about competitive economy. And to compete, you do not have to have natural resources as such, although they are necessary, but you could have what we would call soft power. You could have the knowledge and the skills. And actually the richest countries or the richest people, if you look at is it Forbes or whatever, book of records or whatever, you find that actually the tech companies now, the owners of tech companies, are the richest. And this is knowledge economy. It's not necessarily agriculture or minerals or even industries. So where does Africa now feature in here? Definitely in terms of natural resources, we are among the most endowed in terms of even strategic minerals. And the human resource as nature, I mean, some people even say we are the oldest continent, both, by the way, in the physical age and also the population, that the Garden of Eden may have been in Uganda or Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia. But I think we didn't develop knowledge, the skills, technology has left Africa behind compared to other continents. But another aspect of the economy, you see, when we are looking at the analyzing economy, we should not just look at natural resources only, or even individuals only, but we should also look at institutions. I think it was somebody like a Nobel Prize winner 1993 called North, who talks about institutions. Institutions as mindsets, but also organizational. So Africa still lags behind all the continents, by the way, now, because at one time, about 60 years ago at independence, we were at the same level with some countries in Southeast Asia, the likes of South Korea, the likes of Singapore, Thailand, and the like, and some Latin American countries. But as we talk now, we are the least. I'm talking about averagely. We are the least because, one, technology-wise, we are still behind. If you consider, for example, how many patents are registered. Patents are these rights you register when you discover something, a technology. Patents and copyrights. If you consider patents, Africa lags behind. That one is unfortunate. But also organizationally, institutionally. Institutions, when you go to Southeast Asia, let's take Japan. Japan had an economic rise which was termed a miracle, the Japanese miracle. And there was an institution called MITI, M-I-T-I, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or Ministry of Industry and International Trade, I don't know the order there, which organized the development, coordinated development institutions in Japan, and they spurred growth and development. When you come to Africa, let's say Uganda, where is the MITI of Uganda? It's not there. Uganda. We have the Ministry of Trade, but it is in disarray. They don't have money. Of recent, they are now fighting amongst themselves, permanent secretary versus minister versus so and so. So you find the investments, when you consider public sector investments in Uganda, they are not coordinated. The Uganda Investment Authority is only looking at foreign direct investments. They don't look at public investments in Uganda. So you find public investments in Uganda are just rotting somewhere. I saw it on TV the other day. Kabarore, wherever, those public investments. There is no institution. There are no institutions. You know, in Africa, we don't have institutional power.
In fact, Prof, there are scandals just.
There are scandals, and then they fight over who takes what money coming from World Bank and IMF. Minister of Finance doesn't want to let it go. Trade doesn't want to let it go. Uganda Investment Authority doesn't, you know. So we lack institutional organization, institutional power, and we lack software power, that is technology. That is why we are lacking behind. Not because we do not have human beings who can spur development. Definitely for natural resources, we do have them. Markets, you can always get markets as long as you are powerful and you have got the technology. So, to summarize here, I would say that Africa lags behind because mainly it lacks those two, a technological base and organizational power, institutions. If we can solve those two problems, Africa has got a better potential because we have the best climate. Africa is straddled by the equator. We have 2 seasons. Most countries have 2 seasons every year, whereas others don't have. And those are geographical advantages, but we have the disadvantage of organizational capacity and technological base.
Thank you so much. Professor does it justice, trying to talk to us about our economics and how we organize. I want to come to you, Dr. Ojambo. What Professor talks about, us lacking the technological development and the organization. We have peoples in Africa, we have very knowledgeable and powerful people like yourselves on this panel. Why is it such so that we fail to move technologically, we fail to move in terms of organization and having those institutions that can spur growth and development in this part of the world?
Yeah, maybe before I even answer your question, Philip, we need to put in perspective what we mean by Africa. You see, sometimes when we just say Africa, we are lost in the forest. But you need to somehow put Africa in perspective. And this is how we do it. We have South Africa. South Africa, and maybe its southern neighbors. It's a different Africa. One time I was coming with a person from South Africa. Then we reached Ndebesa. He called a colleague at home and said, "We have now just landed in Africa." This one, we will come. So I asked, why do you say we have landed in Africa? That, yeah, did you know we came from South Africa? Now we are in Africa. Wow. So that second part of Africa, I want us to call it the Sub-Saharan Africa, which is also unique in its own way. Then we have the Arab Africa, or Africa above the Sahara, the Sahel region, where we have Morocco, the Maghreb, Morocco, and so on. So you'll find that those three, each of them, they have similar characteristics by economy. I'll give you an example. The economy of South Africa alone, export values are about $122 billion per the 2022-23 statistics. 2024 I have not yet seen. When you look at the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, is 308 something million, 100 million, just $100 million. No, it is just going there. In fact, we are just pushing to reach $1 billion soon, but we are not yet there. In fact,
clarify, Uganda alone is 50 billion GDP.
No, export.
Oh,
export value. I'm not talking about the economy, the size of the economy. Export value. Of course,
that one is in billions.
Of course, number two is Nigeria. Nigeria alone as a country has about 23 billion, and of course, followed by those Maghreb countries now. Now, the way I've tried to put them is how the economies also look. When you are in Uganda and you go to Malawi and you go to Ghana and you go to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, if you are blindfolded and they opened your eyes, you may think you are still in Uganda. If you go to street in Malawi, in Lilongwe, in Ghana, and so on. So we are almost at this peasant economy of survival, where a majority of the things we use are imported from now China and so on. So because of that, we have had a challenge somehow. We import, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa import more than they export. That is one of the challenge. Two, much of the investments in Sub-Saharan Africa are mainly foreign. They are foreign from foreigners. And that's why, at the end of the day, they control most of the things. For example, in Uganda, if you looked at commercial banks, we may have only 2 or 3. The rest are foreign. And that is everywhere in Malawi, in wherever, and all these places. When you go to South Africa, it's a little bit different. If it is foreign, it is co-owned. You find British and this, Netherlands and this, or even South African on its own. Number 3, unique leadership. The leadership styles are unique. Sub-Saharan Africa has one of the poorest governance indexes in the world. The governance is really poor. In fact, some places are characterized as dangerous places. They don't have any governance of some sort. For example, the parts of Eastern Congo, in many Congos as you go into that Congo region. Then, because of that, as the professor was saying, you cannot have good organizations when you have poor leadership styles. The leaders are sort of kings. They are republics, but who behave like monarchists. You can imagine what is happening now in Togo. Togo has been having leaders, gradual leaders. The leader who was there was the father of the current leader who is there, and now this one is preparing the son. In fact, the other day they were carrying out elections, and they have now changed to a parliamentary democracy, where now they have elected 191 MPs are the ones who are going to select the president. And you can imagine that one is a done deal. The man is going to be there until when he dies. Then the third problem, the fourth issue that they all share is how they finance their budgets. They largely finance their budgets from foreign debts. And therefore, when you look at these countries, their debts are very high. They are indebted. For example, for our case here in Uganda, each one of us has a debt on us already, and even our children to pay the debt. So coming to your issue, the people are there. You have said the people are there, very knowledgeable, and so on. You find that these people are helping some economies elsewhere to do a lot of good things, coming from Sub-Sahara. For example, if you look at some of these World Bank officials, World Bank technocrats come from Sub-Saharan Africa, some of them, majority of them, and for a long time they have been there. If you look at these world organizations like United Nations, you find that some have come from these Sub-Saharan countries, and they have been the leaders there.
Simply the current director of WTO is a Nigerian.
Yes, so that's what I'm saying. So it is not the minds of the people, but I want to agree with my senior colleague there, that once the people are not organized under institutional management to run certain things in a certain model, there is nothing much that you can do. Then lastly is the problem of how the other parts of the world, you know, for us these days we are tired of calling these countries Sub-Saharan or what, third world. We are calling them South, North. North does not mean the campus, but North we mean what we would call Western economies, what we used to call Western economies. So now we have a North-South divide. So how does the North view the South, where Africa, more so Sub-Saharan Africa is? They look at them as a source of raw materials. most of the raw materials that make things in Korea, in these sophisticated countries come from sub-Saharan Africa. Congo, by the way, is one of the leading producers of raw materials in the world, be it minerals, be it everything. Number two, they are also the market. After those things have been produced and processed, they become the market. You find that we import more than we export. And the last issue is that we help the Western world to fight their proxy wars. So that is also something that affects our economy. You find that, for example, America may have a problem with the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. They don't bring Americans to fight here. They come and pick poor Ugandans or Kenyans. They take them there to fight. And sometimes that also affects the economies, because now this becomes the battleground for the other people to solve their problems. If China has a problem with the United States, they come and sort it out in Africa here. Those are some of the issues that make us not to be able to do well, even if we have very good human resource.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that detailed submission about the causes of failures in trying to organize the institutions and policies in these countries of Africa. Mr. Wanda, when you listen to Dr. Ojambo here, he talks about the import, the export in relation to the technology. And recently the president was talking and he says he is tired of listening to things like import support money in the budget. He is tired of listening to things like exporting raw materials from Uganda. This Uganda, and by extension Africa, why do we continue to find ourselves in such a position that we cannot make conclusive and united decisions economically to foster our growth as a people?
Thank you very much, Mr. Muliisa. And the panel so far, the introductions that you've given on this particular topic, one of the things you notice in all these discussions, and especially the current structuring of the discourses on the African continent, you realize most of it goes towards characterization of who we are as a people. But I think what we are blind to is how we got here. In which case, how this, I'm appreciating that, how we can understand how to get out of this particular hole that we find everyone agitating and trying to discuss and trying to get to the bottom of. Right now, in my particular understanding, I would like to divide this thinking into three areas that right now, what we are talking about and discussing mostly is what you would consider Africa's dark moment. It seems all our history and our education and our appreciation of ourselves is limited to understanding Africa as a dark place, as a dark continent, as described by others.
We are dark anyway.
Exactly. But in sorting the darkness is in the question of illumination, in understanding the particular place we are as a society. I think what we would consider or describe as dark is probably about 500 years. And it all seems to have started at around the period of slavery and comes through colonization, and then what we have today as neo-colonization. When you appreciate that as a period of Africa, limited to say 500 to 600 years, then the description kind of wakes you up to a period before this particular description. So Africa is not necessarily dark, but this particular period is dark. And why is it dark? That could be the first question we can appreciate. And then, but before we get to why it's dark, you can step back a little and appreciate what Africa was. As the professor was saying earlier, we are a cradle of humanity. Africa is the cradle of humanity. We are the cradle of civilization. Civilization was initiated on this continent in the Nile Valley. When you mention Nile Valley, don't limit yourself to the Egypt part of it. The Nile Valley comes all the way to the area you would consider today Balkanized as Uganda, South Sudan, Sudan itself, and probably Egypt. That's how it has been Balkanized in this dark period. Prior to that, that wasn't the description of Africa, or the Nile Valley for that matter. It was the whole section. We are also the cradle of culture, because the first settlements of humanity happened on the continent, where we then are able to start generating what we consider agriculture, and what then starts putting together how people relate to each other in a community of sedentary living. That's what Africa has been to the rest of humanity, bringing settlement, agriculture, culture, and from culture is what you get religion. There's almost no religion that doesn't have its roots in Africa. Again, the Nile Valley. Because when you talk of Jesus and Mary Magdalene and the rest of them, and you go back to the sourcing of Osiris and Isis, you find they are designed and described around these particular African entities that came before them. So all this description of a continent fallen fails to appreciate what the continent was before this particular period.
So what went wrong?
Exactly. I think that's where we start now, trying to bring to light that particular aspect. That when there was a period of time, Africa was at the height of its extent and did great things. If you step back beyond 500 years, you will hear of the Moors. They're of a dark complexion, as you said earlier, and they went about the civilization of a different continent that is today considered Europe. The European continent they were civilizing had what was going through a period they considered the European Dark Ages. They also had that period of Dark
Wanda,
Ages.
You bring out all these interesting things about Africa, the history of civilization, the cradle
Yes,
of humanity,
yes.
and so on. And we listen to them, and very many young people out there listen to these beautiful stories, and they are proud of being Africans. But then after they're like, yes, humanity started here, but today it is us that are dying more young. It is us that are not getting enough food. It is us that do not know what is happening elsewhere. And it leaves a little, if
So
not
a
a
taste.
lot more to desire.
And
for
so a
that.
taste in the mouth. I wanted me to complete this particular aspect so that we appreciate our position today.
Please, briefly.
If we appreciate our position today, then we will appreciate how we can get out of it. Otherwise, all these other particular discussions of a dark continent and our dire consequences, without appreciating where we came from and where we can go, will not help us. But at some point, you have to appreciate that Africa dominated the world in areas where you have a history beyond, again, what I was talking about, slavery and the rest of it. You had Mansa Musa travel across the continent and go outside the continent. And in that process of little globalization, you can see how his gold moving process kind of dumped the price of gold across the international system as known then. That was Africa operating with the particular technology of that time and dominating the world. When you hear of Mansa Musa, he's probably considered one of the wealthiest humans ever to live, probably wealthier than most of the living white people we hear of today. When you go to Timbuktu, his particular city in Mali that he developed, it had some of the best writings and civilizations that were dominant or even better than what Europe could afford at the time. So that was then. What happens is that during the period of the dark period of Africa with slavery, what happens is that Africa is totally destroyed. That's one thing we have to appreciate. Africa's population collapses. From a height of a particular period, it collapses to a period where we could not sustain our own stay on the continent. I would give an example, because some of the things you have to localize, especially to us, is what this particular aspect we consider Uganda. Uganda has two particular dominant societies that can, at least anthropologically, be dug through and appreciated through their journey in this period. Buganda, at some point, had a population.
Mr. Moderator, before he goes on, if you won't mind, if you can again build from that history.
Yes, yes.
I think the question is, why were you enslaved? Why were we enslaved? And why didn't we enslave others? Can we answer that question?
Yeah, we will
Exactly,
come to that.
because
We
you
will
say
come
we
to
were
that.
dominant at the time.
Yes.
But then slavery comes, we are taken
Yeah,
over.
but why were we enslaved?
Colonialism comes, the dominant group is dominated. How did it come about?
All communities, China has a 5,000-year history. There was a period it was also destroyed. And for now, it's only coming through a period of the last 100 years, not even 100, 50 years, when it's coming back to the fore. In fact, its own trajectory is the last 30 years, more than anything, recovering from a period where it had collapsed. So when you have a history of China of 5,000 years, and you have the last 100 in which it was dominated, it more or less disappeared, almost collapsed and was split up, and it's only in the last 30 years that it has risen to become the second most powerful country in the world. You will appreciate that any society, whether dominant or not, has peaks and troughs it can go through. And Africa is also experiencing its own bottom. But without that particular agency of appreciation by Africans themselves, that it's just a period that we are going through, that will be temporary unless we organize ourselves internally. We can always come out out again. But I wanted us to appreciate this particular aspect, especially Uganda and Bunyoro for that matter. Buganda's population in 1900 was double its population in 1920. The same applies to Bunyoro. Population had collapsed in that interim. And yet prior to that, through slavery and everything, Buganda's population had been collapsing. Through the religious civil wars that happened in the overthrow of Mwanga, the population was collapsing. These particular interventions that are collapsing the population to the extent that they cannot sustain their own natural area always collapses the society. What Africa is going through today, and all the problems that we can point to where you count this trade deficit, you count a lot of other things, happens because our population could not sustain the areas in which we have been operating for the last 100 years through these particular interventions of slavery, of colonialism, and neocolonialism. In fact, within Uganda, I think the population is only starting to catch up now in the last 50 years or so, but since independence, Bunyoro is also only starting to recover, and other areas that looking forward, this one is also very important. There is a particular view that we may have a population of almost 135 million within this particular space called Uganda. With that kind of population, you have ability and forces to force us to focus and at least to look through or focus towards dominating the rest of the world again.
Thank you so much for that really detailed historical kind of status of this African continent and its peoples. Honorable Ochieno, I want us to come now to the modern economics of the world in relation to Africa. We normally talk about these institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and how they came about. What is Africa's position and fit in this particular system?
Yeah, I gave a close listening to my three colleagues, and it happens that I am the politician here. I want to commend them all, but clearly for the purposes of this program, there's just one thing lacking on this continent. I looked through the communique from Nairobi by these leaders trying to regurgitate what would others would say we've seen it before. Prior to the Nairobi stuff, the big thing on the African continent was indigenous, you can call it, was the new partnership for Africa's development. NEPAD, pushed by the president, I still consider with absolute respect, Thabo Mbeki of South Africa. It gave me a huge amount of hope as a young African then, and as an African thinker, and as somebody from Uganda People's Congress, who was not only an African nationalist, but somebody who completely believes that we need to answer the questions that all of us are raising, and including specifically the question that Professor is trying to put to my young good friend Wanda. We basically need to know what happened, but particularly now, much more urgently, how do we get out of this nonsensical mess? Away from NEPAD, Tony Blair had brought in this thing called the Commission for Africa, and I ask and I urge our young, particular audiences, particularly young guys, both NEPAD and the Commission for Africa, to look at this background very, very seriously. Blair brought the Commission thing, interestingly, post the Iraqi war, which was extremely unpopular in Britain, and particularly unpopular around the world. And you can imagine, I was like what young people should be doing, a very critical friend of the British Labour Party and the Blair government, and very critical about the Iraqi war. And I was privileged, I'm saying this, privileged, to be actively involved in British politics and indeed European politics, and indeed Pan-Africanist politics, including the politics here trying to wake up Ugandans that we need the space to be able to think, which is part of the challenge facing us. And so Blair had to respond to a certain section of the left of politics in Britain that saw Blair and Bush going to conquer for oil and reviewing their policies and saying this is how Anglo-America, from slavery to colonialism to now new colonialism to through the IMFs and World Banks, go and chop off from the rest of the world their oils in the Middle East and in Africa, sucking. What do we do? So the left was challenging the establishment of the global north. When are we going to stop this immorality? And if we stop it, what else do we do? Blair, beyond Africa, is a bit of a small, long story, had to convince the British populace that we are now going to push effort and energy on the Middle East peace process so that we settle the Arab-Israeli issue. Because the argument had been that part of the Iraqi thing was the underlying unresolved conflict, which by and large is true. Ironically, that battle is today. And ironically, in this guy's communique today, the other day, I really don't see reference to it. Granted, they've talked about the other urgent thing, which is climate change, and granted, of course, talked about the question of youth and employment. What is our challenge as a continent? What happened to the Commission for Africa? I knew it wasn't particularly going very far because Blair was impressing, his domestic audience, trying to fudge this new Africa, particularly the lot that included Museveni, Kagame, and Afaki and Meles, the new breed of African leaders. And quite clearly, without prejudice and quite totally, all these were new African dictators, except
new breed
the
of
boys
African
for
dictators.
The Bretton Woods institution, who were basically enablers for sacking Africa. So he did that. So I quite clearly knew it was going to go wrong. It was not going to go anywhere. And so I was a critical opponent, and I was very well placed, including nearly asked a very good friend of mine, to get a job with the African Commission for Africa. Why? Because I thought, was it an opportunity for me then to influence this, if really it ever happens? I don't know where the Commission for Africa is today. Back to NEPAD, important. Where is NEPAD today? NEPAD relatively is the indigenous thing, but I think Mbeki is sort of relatively quiet, he's retired, he's an old man, but he's still a great African thinker. But have you ever heard Museveni mention NEPAD? No. Has he? No. I don't remember him mentioning it. The big issue facing this continent today is leadership. Absence of African leadership, which we don't have. I had prayed that post Mbeki, we would have a Chikaya Kikwete. I saw you being part of the impressive youth group at Makerere University, Phil, a fantastic young presenter here. When President Kikwete came here a few weeks ago, I was there. And but just as Kikwete was retiring, I was hoping, Robert, that Kikwete would provide the leadership that Mbeki had done but had not done enough of, so that this continent has got a big name. Like we had Nyerere, like we had Kawunda, and like some of you guys, you can go ahead and have breakfast that you don't want to say, like Obote, and like the Anthony Diops. So the 5 big names around the continent after Nkrumah left. These guys were not only acting together, they were thinking together. They were not only acting together, but they were doing exemplary things. Let me now bring that to Uganda. What was it? After our quest for independence was about emancipation of our peoples, absolutely taking cognizance of the history as Wanda talks about, So we know, and where I slightly disagree with one, the population beat is one for Museveni's Dar es Salaam economics, which is the Bush economics, that, the bigger the population, the more the opportunities. But, Wanda, if you go to Bugisu and then you pass your way back to Samia and go via Busoga, and you see really this 7 children thing and you see the state of people, young people, it's possibly not about that. The challenge is, I feel, we need an urgent leadership on this continent. That's the broader sense of not localized specific to Uganda, and let's give an example. We need a big thinkers on this continent. That thinker possibly need to be either serving president, or a former president, or an emergent Lumumba, or an Ochieno, if you guys give an opportunity, to go around this continent and bang tables. We need to do that. But we also need to be able to do so that we're to reach beyond this continent, so that it becomes Pan-Africanist, so that we engage the African resources in Brazil, we engage the African resources in Haiti, and that resources must not only be the human resources, but human resources that includes thinkers and, if you like, the historical archaeologists of Africa, to do it, to redraw the engine and capacity of the African continent. Now, what are the missing links? The missing link is that leadership. The missing link is the fact that in this continent, we are not only the poorest, but with the wealth, but with the least educated. Because proper economics will say, if you are to turn around and become a sensible face like the Japans and the South Koreas that my brother is talking about, we need to be able to invest in education. We don't. We need to invest in infrastructure. We don't. We need to invest in innovation. We don't. In fact, when it comes to innovation, every young person who asks a president a question, every journalist who asks a president a question, those are thinking innovation. There are problems. There are lessons. So we need to invest in those ones. But while we do that, we need to invest in research. The basic thing is actually we need guys to invest in education, education in the broadest sense. UPC had it, as we said, fight against ignorance, poverty, and disease. So basically put it simple, odd like that. That is what this country is lacking. That's what this country is lacking. When we do that, we shall then come to Museveni's PLE economics of value addition. Wanda comes from Bugisu. You remember, I keep on talking about this thing. ATM, ATM used to produce my shirts. ATM is dead. African Textile Mill is dead. It's a conversation we had with the professors the other time. And Museveni talks about value addition. What value addition? My place where we used to, Nagongara, where we had a factory for cotton milling, where on the one hand, the finished products, for your information, we would take it to Nitel or take it to their ATM, and then we also have seeds, from oil from that. It's now a police station, and you know what? It is sinking with the rain. That is what is causing this continent. The rest of the other continents are rising. I don't really believe that we need to wait for our population to become unacceptably big. We just need to provide the leadership and invest. Now, quick, few seconds. If you see what UPC did between 1962 and 71, notwithstanding everything else, you see that there was a genuine attempt, to turn around not only the economy, but to turn around the livelihoods of the people. Now, if you pick that, if what UPC was doing, and put it, suppose Tanzania was doing the same thing, or Kenya was doing it, and you put the East African community together, and then you take a Pan-Africanist perspective to see where is Ghana, and then where is Haiti, and what is the livelihood of our people where? In Brazil. That is sort of the Africa that we need. Now, our founding parents had those ideas. They tried notwithstanding anything. My biggest worry today, Professor, is I actually don't see any of these leaders. Within iota of these other things, these guys are just down there seemingly for the jobs. You can read Ruto's statement, and it's very clear that it's been written for him by some communication assistant who's now very privileged to be somewhere, having come from Nyayo House to State House in Nairobi. It's an extraordinary thing, but it's urgent. We need to deal with, particularly with the possibility that in 50 years' time we shall be contributing 1/3 of the global population, which one is talking about. But most importantly, that amidst that, climate change means that we are killing the forests of Congo in exchange for gold and dubious items, shortcut for China and their other markets. It's urgent.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ochieno. I want to come back to Professor here, and again with something related. It's good you talk about President Ruto. One of the things that came out before the statement he made was his celebration. He was at a church function and he was giving testimony of how he had been the first African president to be invited to the White House for an official visit in the last 20 years or something like that. And
so it's very proud.
very proud to do that. But I want to ask Professor, still in the economics, what is the actual position and role of Africa in the economics of the world today?
Well, you are saying actual, or what should be there. If it is actual, we are the suppliers of raw materials and the importers of finished goods, which is very unfortunate, that kind of arrangement, which can also apply to the global north and the global south that Dr. There was talking about. But before I come to that one, let me maybe first come in what my colleagues have talked about. I think continuously to point out how great we were, which is true. We are not disputing it. And then the other people came and dominated us. Pointing it out to me is not so helpful. We have to find out why. We first answer the question, why were we dominated? If we start with the slave trade he talked about, that Europe managed to dominate the world. That's when you started having these big empires now, British, Portuguese, Spaniard, and whatever. In the modern era now, I'm talking about the modern era, otherwise there were other empires before that. It's because of technology. They had the steamship engine. They had the gunpowder. They knew how to navigate the seas, which we wouldn't, you see? So they developed technology. But besides technology, they developed states. They had states to organize society. The public institutions organizing society so that people do not live like in the Hobbesian time when there was death. The people were killing each other, you know. Organization of society is very critical before you come into the policies. So I wanted us to note that the technology base is very critical. He mentioned China, even. China has since really come up. First of all, they organized society. The Communist Party organized society there. But somehow Mao Zedong clogged further development of society. When he died, he was not removed. And his proteges, including his wife, were actually imprisoned. They removed that.
The gang of three.
The gang of four.
Four, eh?
When they were removed, then policies spurred development in China, but in an organized society. The problem we have in Africa, the whole continent, by the way, the whole continent is still lagging behind, by the way. Even if you consider South Africa is talking about, it's not a developed country. It is a developing country. Even North Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, they are ahead of us. But as President Museveni sometimes uses an analogy, they are just having a pygmy
Taller than the other.
Taller than the other, but they are all pygmies. Sorry to use that that one. There is no developed country in Africa.
No.
They are all either developing countries or least developed countries. The question is how, why the whole continent, with all the resources it has, the natural resources, is not developed. So we have to look at organization of society. Southeast Asia has a states functioning. We don't have states functioning to organize the economy. Our states are malfunctioning. There are states which developed the country. Development states. We don't have development states. These states we have are just paying us lip service. They are not organizing development. Why? Many people have observed a phenomenon in Africa, which is in other countries, but is the worst in Africa. Patronage. Political patronage wastes resources. So, if you do not organize your resources and you squander them, you waste them. The resources I'm talking about here is not only financial resources, but even the human resource. In Southeast Asia, which is a recent example of development, they have harnessed the human resource by not picking mwana wani, mwana wa gundi. Here, people who are put in the right positions to run institutions are put there because they are royalists, or they come from a certain tribe, or a certain family, not because of their merit. So unless Africa appoints people in the right places on merit, we are going to lag behind. Europe may not be like Southeast Asia, which has used that human resource in that way of sourcing, identifying the right people, but they have institutions. The institutions are working. In Africa, we have big men and women. We don't have institutions. We need to shift from big man syndrome to institutions, to institutional building. Once you have institutions that are functioning, that are organizing society, then you can spur development. And they will also overcome wastage. Because all human beings are capable of wastage. All human beings are capable of stealing. But let me differ from my colleagues here who are talking about that the problem of Africa is leadership. I want to change it the other way around. The problem of Africa, because the leaders will continue being misbehaving, I can see. And the more we continue saying that the problem of Africa is leadership, we are not going very far. I think the problem of Africa, okay, it is leadership, but it is secondary, it's not primary. The problem of Africa is the citizens not holding their leaders accountable. A human being has that selfish tendency. It is like in a rational that human beings will tend to do that. But they are wasting resources and we are looking good. They are wasting our funds. You see how Parliament is wasting our funds. And people are clapping for these MPs. When they come for elections, you see people clapping for them. You see people kneeling for them. You see people calling them Sir, Madam, Honorable. Why not hold these leaders accountable? By all means, telling them off, holding them by their collars, throwing them out of those offices, and we put the country to order. So citizens, if I can use economics terms, they talk about the demand and supply. For an economy to do very well, there must be an equilibrium. We don't have an equilibrium in the politics of supply and demand. We have a lot of supply, i.e. the leaders. Uganda has got 2,000, more than 2 million, sorry. Uganda has got more than 2 million. Let anybody challenging me.
Contestable positions. Yeah.
No, okay. 2 million elected leaders. Uganda has. You can go and check with the Electoral Commission. USA, which is more than 100 times richer than Uganda, has got only 600,000 elected leaders. Uganda has got 2 million
Useless ones.
elected leaders. To do what? To squander resources, to mismanage our resources, to step on each other's toes instead of working for the people. Citizens should reject this patronage, but they can't do it. I think maybe the problem is that we are post-colonial states, and we are people who were brought together by a foreign force, not an internal dynamics. It was not a dynamics from within. And you have got this tribalism we have. You know, we cannot come up together to move this country and hold our leaders accountable so that the resources are not wasted. You can see the example of this recent strike, that the traders strikes there. I'm not talking about supporting it or not supporting it. But when most of the towns went on strike, Mbarara didn't go on strike. Why? This is sectarianism. Maybe the people of Mbarara say, but we have Museveni, he's from here. For us, that is not our concern. You know? Now, as long as, and I'm not referring to Mbarara only or Uganda only, the rest of Africa still has that perspective of politics. And therefore, we don't have nation states. Why Southeast Asian countries have overtaken us is that to appreciate the problem of Africa, actually, historically, is that Southeast Asian countries, although they were colonized and got independence almost at the same time with us, they have got a long history of states. Their states are older than African states. The problem of Africa is the states. The issue I talked about, organization of society. We don't have orderly society. We don't have functioning states. That's why I always talk here and elsewhere that we need to have a functioning computer, both hardware and software, so that we have got a nation state. And once we have a nation state to organize society, to organize the economy, to organize public affairs, to organize international relations, to organize security, we shall develop very fast and catch up. But as long as we are marching time in this issue of having no states, we pride ourselves that we have states in Africa. We do not have states. These are weak states waiting to collapse. These are weak states unless they are strong, and in return they organize society. But again, I don't know how to put this one. We citizens are partly responsible. You see somebody squandering public resources and you admire them. You just laugh at them because somebody has used the state funds to buy a vehicle of 600 million or $1 billion. When it passes by you, you start smiling. You look at the vehicle as something very admiring. I really get annoyed with Ugandans. I mean, how can somebody misappropriate public resources, buy a good vehicle, and you admire the vehicle? Why not get out this person and put him on the street and make him responsible? That's how countries developed. Public resources must be used not wastefully, and we shall develop this continent. But as long as we have weak states, now we have military coups, they have come back. We have term limits, they are around. We have age limits, they are around. We have elections in some countries like Congo where you have elections in one area, another, and they are not there. Sudan has postponed the elections I don't know how many times. Khartoum is nowhere. Somalia is no country.
Thank you.
You know, and then we can't develop.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. And indeed, you Ugandans and Africans should stop
Citizens.
admiring people that squander your resources and get a little bit looking better in terms of physical outlook. The Citizens Chat show takes a very short break and we shall be right back.
Human rights and legal rights that allow individuals to access, use, create and publish digital media or to access and use computers, other electronic devices and telecommunication networks. Digital rights include a right to freedom of expression, information and communication through technology, a right to privacy and data protection, a right to credit for personal works, a right to universal and equal digital access, a right to identity, a right to anonymity, a right to be forgotten, and a right for protection of minors, among others. The state's digital rights are frequently violated through various unfair actions, for example, blockage of websites and social networks, theft of credentials, unauthorized use of people's data for personal gain, privacy intrusion, online censorship, arrests and intimidation of online users, internet blockages, and the proliferation of laws and regulations that undermine the potential of technology to drive social, economic, and political development worldwide. It is hence every citizen's responsibility to respect rights of other digital users and to speak out or report to the responsible parties when one's rights are violated.
You are still on Uganda's leading freedom platform, the Civic Space TV, and this is the Citizens Chat Show. I am Phillip Muliisa. Today on the chat, I have Honorable Ochieno Joseph from Uganda People's Congress. I have Professor Mwabutsya and Ndebesa. I have Mr. Wotsomu, Wanda, and I have Dr.Robert Ojambo, and we're discussing Africa's chances in trying to fight back to the global economic architecture in a bid to see this Africa progress to better standards of living for its citizens and everyone that is there to benefit from the Africa. Now, while we left off, Professor was talking to us about the problem of state building on the African continent, and he says we keep weak, therefore we cannot progress in the fight. I want to come to you, Dr. Ojambo. State building. We have been independent averagely for 60 years as a continent. Of course, we shall have a couple of countries, South Africa, Zimbabwe, that came in a little later. But building the state Professor talks about, what does it take and why are we failing?
Yeah, the colonial state had its purpose, and its purpose was to facilitate colonialism. So when we took up independence in the 60s, we inherited the colonial state in most of the African countries. But now what we didn't change was the purpose. What was the purpose of this independent state? I've said this once and again. Many African, and here I want to really restrict myself to sub-Saharan Africa. Maybe I'll just give example of South Africa here and there. Because the other, I still think that the other country is a little bit unique. In their own ways, I agree with Prof that they may not be developed as he suggests, but they're a little bit different from us. If you land in Rabat and, as I said, Cape Town or Johannesburg, you may think you are in Europe. You may think, if you are not careful. But if you land in Accra, in Dar es Salaam, in these other countries, and they just remove your if they are blindfolded, you will know you're in Africa. So the state, as Prof said, is weak. But why is it weak?
That one.
The people who took up the state never understood the science of the state. The state is not supposed to have nationality. The state is not supposed to have a religion. The state is not. The state is supposed to be a very sophisticated system to manage the affairs of the country. And that's why you see in countries like Uganda, you don't differentiate between the state and the government. They are fused together. Governments change depending on the whims of the people. The state is supposed to be constant because the state is supposed to look after the security of the people, the economy, the sovereignty, and so many of those things. In other words, we are talking about the army, we are talking about the state, we are talking about the economy, we are talking about the bureaucracy of running in a society. And that's why you see, I have given this example always. If the American state was like these African states, this man, Trump, was not going to leave power. And he had vowed not to leave power. And for a while, people were worried. So they asked the state controller that Trump is saying he will not leave power. Are you sure he will leave? Because there they have even a state house controller. And the state house controller said, just wait for that day. Trump will go. And indeed, I was waiting for that day. And Trump went very well. He even, in fact, by the time he went, they had disabled him to do a number of things, including even some press conference. He was not allowed. He had removed the security code from him because they knew he had become erratic, which is not possible here. In Africa here, the president is the state, and his government controls the state. That's why, for example, if you look at NRM, the staff of NRM, I want people to go and check where their salaries come from. It doesn't come from NRM. It comes from the state coffers. They draw money from the state, and yet they're supposed to be drawing money from their government. Look at the vehicles they drive. Look at everything. For example, NRM is not allowed to use our security to guard them. They should be having their own security. But they use UPDF. UPDF is synonymous to NRM. So here we don't have a state, and it is because of patronage. The other thing which has created a very big problem in Africa, we wanted to go back to our kingdom way of dealing with things. Little did we know that we had already left the kingdoms. We had been colonized, so the kingdom things had gone away. So the presidents, when they came in, they thought that they can use this chance to restore, or some of them to even get a chance to become kings for the first time. And look at their behaviors. Look at the behaviors of our presidents here. They behave like kings. They have palaces, they have heirs, they want their children to replace them, they want their children become princes and prince and things like this. Other than Trump, Trump is the one really who organized the American politics. When those other presidents were there, you would not see their children, their wives, their what, in these things. But here, the wife of a president can fire a minister, and you go. It used to happen in Zimbabwe. Margaret would fire a minister, and you have to go. It used to happen during the time of Mwinyi in Tanzania. The wife of Mwinyi would go and organize a trade and things like that. So there is that behavior. We had an overdose of our kingdom, like which do not even help. I've been telling people that these kingdoms were here for a very long time, but they left people more vulnerable than they built them, including Buganda kingdom. I disagree with my colleague here. I came in Kampala when I was an adult, and I strayed to behind Bulange there in Kasubi. And I was wondering, I was studying history, and they were telling me this was a developed place. Now, I was just next to the palace, and the place looked like my village, really like my village, disorganized and so many things. So the kingdoms only were there to serve the kings, but the people were really suffering. So they carried that forward. But as I end, states, these given states, I want still to go back to my statistics. I'm not normally a person of statistics, but today, since we are discussing the economy, I just want to use these statistics to give the viewers a picture. I told you that South Africa, their total trade export is $135 billion as per 2022-23. Import is 136. So they have a trade deficit like all African countries, but of 1 billion US dollars. The sub-Saharan Africans put together, Malawi, Uganda, all of them, they have export of $310,083 million value.
That's wrong. That's wrong. Uganda, let me give you an example of Uganda. Uganda today exports gold worth 1.2 billion US dollars. This is Uganda.
Alone.
Kenya gets more than $1 billion from tourism alone. $1 billion.
US dollars.
You are talking
Okay,
about
that
millions.
is US dollars.
You are
Okay.
talking about millions.
So their import is 559. So there is a
559 what?
Let's take billion.
Billion maybe.
Yes.
Not a million.
Let's take your statistics. Let's take your statistics. Still you have a deficit of 210 billion. That is a huge thing. In other words, you will have to run this country by debts. You cannot run a country without borrowing. So because of that, it's quite difficult. You know, when people are poor, for those who study political economy, poverty creates weak states. Weak states are created by poverty. So you find that we are struggling for almost what is not there. So people struggle to go and eat the scarce resources. And at the end of the day, because they cannot, there is no trickle down, everybody struggles to go up there. And everybody who reaches up there becomes a dictator because they don't want to go back. You can imagine if somebody today wants to take Museveni to his 40 years ago or 50 years ago when the poor man was walking bare feet, he would kill you. He would really kill you. That's why he kills people. If he feels that I'm saying killing, like for example, using his examples, when he went to Luwero and he commanded a war. That's what I'm saying. He does not slaughter people. I don't want to be quoted. So he will kill you to get power.
Or by denying them.
He doesn't care. He will kill people.
Robert,
to get
because that's
power.
important, or by denying them essential medical facilities so that people die as a result.
And so is even other. So you
Denying
can
them directly
you can-
or inefficiency.
you cannot build a good state
It takes
when
responsibility.
you are still killing your own people. Somebody will argue, but how did this Britain and what have you begin? The British, if you study history, they got rich out of looting. But for them, the good thing that their kings were landed aristocrats, were rich people. So when they were going to steal, they were not going to steal because they were needy. They went and stole and put in public
for empire.
to build the British Empire. So the wealth became part of the British Empire, part of the... Even Belgium, where we had an individual called Leopold. Leopold was forced, after making a lot of money, to go into government and also start building government. Now in Africa, we have had very poor people vie for positions in authority. If you look at the history of our leaders, majority of them, even their background, sometimes some of them, when you talk about their background, is a crime. You start discussing a father of a president, they will take you to prison. Check Uganda, check Kenya. There was a time when they were saying that a former president of Kenya was a Ugandan. And if you talked about it in Nairobi, you would have a lot of problems. He's associated to coming from Bunyoro. From Bunyoro. Then the Kaunda was being told that he was a Malawian. And Nyerere was being told that he was a Ugandan. He was not a Tanzanian. So their background itself is very poor. Then the other thing is the army. You know, in Europe and where states are stronger, the army was part of the empire. There were no personal armies in Europe. You check from a long time ago. In Africa, people come with their armies. Everybody who come into leadership have their army. And that army, translating it into a national army is quite very difficult. A very good example is UPDF. UPDF up to today still think that the only leader they can pay allegiance to is Yoweri Museveni. You check during elections, they even sing, and they sing patriotic songs, and the leader is only that one. Everybody who is looked at as opposition becomes an enemy to UPDF. You can imagine you're in a country in Uganda, but you become an enemy to the UPDF. Very dangerous.
Thank you, Doctor, for that. I want to come to you, Mr. Wanda. The conversations we have on the continent today is getting positions in some of these big international institutions, the World Bank, the IMF. We talk about getting a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. And at the same time, unfortunately, we have our leaders running to these countries to ask for aid, to ask for monies. When they fall sick, they go to London, to New York for treatment, and so on. Is this quest achievable for this Africa?
Thank you again, Muliisa. As you've noted, the discussion around the continent, we've been touching on a lot of issues that are descriptive and most anecdotal. They are all trying to describe something. And from different angles, you notice the description does not get to the bottom of the issue. And it's the reason earlier on I tried to give us that grand tour of what Africa actually is. I was talking of what Africa was. I was digging into how it came to be what it is today. The how was not complete. But when you appreciate the how, you'll appreciate all these particular areas they are touching on. First of all, the Balkanization of the continent. The splitting it into unfunctional states was not an African decision. It was not a localized decision. Our history professor will tell us of the Berlin Conference. This comes about where Africa is balkanized and cut into small entities that don't necessarily describe or fit into what the people themselves are or describe themselves into. So what you have as a state in Africa was never conceptualized by an African. It was never put in place to build on what the pillars of what was on the ground.
In other words, what you say, Mr. Wanda, is that this Africa now needs to sit back, Africanize its boundaries, Africanize its systems so as to be able to
That's
compete.
a very complicated question. That's why when we talk of what you consider political independence, the first order of business was to retain the colonial structure as balkanized at the Berlin Conference. That was the first order of business by the so-called, what you're trying to call of leaders. Everyone is talking, we don't have leaders, but what was being represented then was not going beyond what was supposed to be the continent, but was retaining what the Balkanization decided.
Briefly, in your view, do you think they took the right decision in keeping these boundaries?
I think when we dig deeper, you find that all the complaints we've talked about so far are all originating those particular Balkanizations. One of the aspects of that Balkanization is that you find Africa as the continent with the most landlocked states or countries, for that matter. In the whole world, Africa has the most landlocked countries. And one aspect of landlockedness is unviability of the state. In fact, the only viable landlocked country that you can talk of is in Europe, and that would be Switzerland and possibly Austria. But they are so viable for the way they've structured themselves to deal with that landlockedness. The neutrality of Switzerland is based on the fact that it's landlocked. It's a level of efficiency. Everyone talks of Switzerland designed around efficiency and doing the most precise way of doing things because of the landlockedness. Those particular aspects.
Moderator, if you don't mind, that as it may be, which I'm not disputing of landlockedness and being a challenge. What about the African countries that are not landlocked? Yeah. Why are they developing?
I was going to come to that, but we first have to appreciate how the large number of landlockedness in one area of the continent then drowns and pulls down the rest to not develop. Because ultimately, all the others have to relate with each other, and then we start cutting each other into pieces, and we cannot ever grow beyond those particular aspects. But that Balkanization goes even deeper. This is, to me, one of the biggest problems. I was earlier on telling the professor and Ochieno the fact that, and Ochieno, the fact that when you go into rural Africa today, across the continent, you'll find some of the most divided communities anywhere in the world. And this division is religious. You'll go and find on Sunday an aspect of Catholicism deep in an African village. You'll find an aspect of Protestantism, and nowadays you'll find a whole proliferation of what you'd call pastors of one note or another, all deciding themselves as different from everyone else in organization at that level on a Sunday. That then, how do you build that as a political system to go beyond the village to up to the district, on and on to form a state? That again is also balkanized. Division on division on division on division on division creates some of the aspects that then you think that the kind of ruler who comes out of these particular aspects and fully utilizes them to stay in office will have to work on those divisions and exacerbate them. And then you'll find that these are the particular ones who will stay the longest, who will be what you'll consider successful in their longevity at the expense of developing that particular space of Africa into a developed community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Honorable Ochieno, when I come to you, still about the same issue, getting ourselves positioned in these big international institutions, IMF, World Bank, President Ruto keeps talking about how we get unfair, pricing of the monies we borrow from these institutions, paying 5 times higher, getting a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, getting our voices heard in the UN, not just putting that vote. How do we achieve this?
I think that's actually secondary. I still want to come back to my point that we know the history. We know how we've gotten here. We, by and large, as a panel, we generally understand what the issues are, and we're enumerating them. The issue is, how do we get out of here? My considered view, repeat, is leadership. And leadership, not from the perspective of how many elected positions are, but rather, leadership as one, an idea, a vision, a drive, a resolve, determination, and the mind of that idea. That could be an individual, could be groups of persons who are saying, this is, guys, this is where we are at, this is where we came from, the state in which we are is unacceptable. We need to find ourselves out of this mess. How do we do it? Chat together and push. When I was giving you NEPAD, when I was giving the Commission for Africa examples, when I was giving you Baker as an example, when I was giving you Hope on Chikwete, when I was giving you some of the post-independence leaders, that's what I was talking about. Because even the Berlinians, there's an element of leadership organization that you guys, let's go and sack these desperate dark guys who've got huge amount of resources. Let's go and divide. That's what I'm trying to talk about. Some enabler. We can't dismiss individual leaders because, as I said, and sometimes it becomes very crazy, very, very risky, defeatist. And while fair enough, my brother Ndebesa suggests that less about the people at the helm, but more about the ordinary African citizens who desperately should go ahead and stop. Yeah, wake Africans, particularly wake up young Ugandans, young Africans. Yes, but let's not forget that in Uganda's case, for example, where we are today, we've got citizens, including professionals, street beggars. It's not what it was when I was a young student of your age group. I didn't know how someone who doesn't know you would come and beg you for 20,000 shillings. I didn't know how people would want to go to work, but to sack public resources. In the civil service work, there was a culture. So it's really about leadership. And finally, more recently, out of Tanzania, even after Mwinyi, emerged this guy Magufuli. He came up and banged the table. I don't want to use it as he banged the table and said, you guys, Tanzanians, it's no longer going to be business as usual. Tanzania changed. And that's what I'm saying. So this continent needs something like that. Now, Wotsomu is talking about the post-Berlin stuff. Actually, to be fair to post-independence African leaders, and I know part of our problem as Africans is we want to associate with success that is possibly linked to our blood or linked to our thinking. We rarely want to give credit where it is due. And that's a big challenge for us. And for us as an intellectual group, maybe those are some of the things that we need to do, particularly when we're having these difficult conversations, including that I may not necessarily agree with Mbeki about NEPAD, but I think there are one or two things that we should be able to pick. So, at independence, what happened? It is true that we gained predominantly independence as individual nation states, Wotsomu. But you know what happened? Immediately, key leaders thinking Africa emerged from the Nkrumahs. The conversations have actually been even pre-Ugandan independence. That's how if you follow Patrice Lumumba shortly before his death, how the Ghanaians got involved with the liberation struggles in Congo and Guinea and all these guys linking up with the cabals, some of the other African nationalists who are basically Africans from America who did not necessarily have citizenship on this main continent. That is the leadership. These guys were thinking, but fast forward, how did the Organization of African Unity come? These guys say that, group of us, we need to begin to think how to reclaim this continent. Now, the pace might be a subject of discussion. The depth of content and context might be different. For example, Nkrumah was radically for this one government, one Africa now at independence. But a number of leaders, including Nyerere and Obote, pushed for this. We need this thing, comrades. But let's wake up to the reality that we might be pushing for this one Africa. Now, because of what I'm saying, it's not going to be easy to bring together these already independent ones and be fighting different wars. Let's seek to liberate all African countries. And then all the liberated ones, put them on the pot. And that's why now the struggles for Southern African liberation became a slightly different thing. So let's do it in phases with the regional blocks. Now, when I look back, it was the sensible thing to do, but somehow, these guys got lost, many of themselves, and will not achieve those ones. What am I saying? I am saying that immediately after independence, independence and African leaders tried deliberately to say, you guys, let's find a way of killing this colonial border by all of us coming together. Hence, as I said, the Organization of African Unity and then the regional bloc. And the regional blocs, I think you hosted us here recently when we discussed the East African community, and I gave the examples that Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, the aspirations as early as 1967 was so holistic, so real, that we're a tiny, close to a near nation state compared to this African community that the Musevenis boast of today. So these things can be done. And I'm simply saying, for that reason I'm saying, it needs leadership. But now back to your other question about the global economic order. It's actually shambolically shameful that if you follow again the root of statements, it's like, how do we perfect ourselves to prepare ourselves to go ahead and dance to the colonial masters of the Bretton Woods institutions, the organization that has so grossly failed the sparring of growth and development of this continent. I would have expected that today what we should be discussing instead of that is the African alternative. The African alternative, not about African nations coming together to say let's buy China or let's move east, but what really is the indigenous equivalent of NAPAD. So that when we're able to do that, we say that, well, the Western development agencies, what is it that they provide? The Eastern development agencies, if represented by China, what does it provide? The, say, Chinese, the Russian agencies in terms of technology, what are we able to pick from them? But as a part of continents, this is our thinking direction for our economic emancipation. What these guys are talking about in Nairobi, in my opinion, is not any different from what the early neoliberal structured adjustment programs of the early 80s were. Meaning, basically, where's your coffee and where's your cotton? Okay, we shall do a little bit of value addition and we shall make some little profit out of it. So in other words, there is no big thinking, there's no leadership out of it. And as I said, to me, it is taking us back generally, really, to square one. But more important, though, is that many of the leaders who are going to be doing these things are men, predominantly men, who don't have the mandate of the people. Granted, they've talked about involving young people. Granted, they've talked about having civil society organizations. Some of these are actually rather patronizing things. Why? Because they pick some of these other people, go on grand halls in Nairobi, feel present, but at the end of the day, come back to some of the points my brethren here talked about. The fleets of cars of Mr. Museveni, the fleets of cars of my beautiful sister Anita Mungi, the fleets of dubious dollars rolling into the streets of Kampala, and the potholes that had to break, my car and make me come 20 minutes late, you guys waiting for me gratefully. Those are the issues. So I think, yes, our citizens need to wake up. They're responsible, but how did we get here? There was once a point in time in this country, just give me a second. There was once a point in time in this country where university students in this country ever had a contribution to a national debate. And national leaders listened to university students, meaning student leaders, not necessarily even at a holistic university. What went wrong? To the extent that now even members of parliament mean nothing. That even ministers mean nothing. That sometimes even ministers have to sweet talk wives of certain individuals in a certain family in order to get the hearing of a president. If that is the manifestation of the challenge we're facing as a continent, then the Nairobi conversation is another waste of time and resources.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ochieno. Professor, from Nairobi, like he says, we came out with something, the Nairobi Declaration, talking about a few things. Commitment of African leaders to this development agenda, financing, and so on. But the African continent has had very many of these. Remember the Lagos Plan of Action about health, Kigali Declaration about the other one, trade, health. You have something called the Africa Agenda 2063. They are here, very many of them, but we seem not to be interested in them. We're not respecting them. We're not committed. Why and how do we start thinking positive towards these agreements we get every other day?
Thank you. I will come to that about the African continent. That is coordinating African continent unity or strengthening African unity. But let me first also make my observations about your first question about whether Africa can have a global influence or can shape global affairs, of course, in its favor. First of all, as we stand now, we have a challenge, is that to have a voice in the global system and shape global happenings, you must have military strengths. And Africa doesn't have. Technological strengths, Africa doesn't have. Economic strengths, Africa doesn't have it. In the past, Africa had the moral strengths. They have moral authority. The people like Nyerere, like Nasser of Egypt, Mandela of South Africa, Leopold Senghor of Senegal, Sekou Touré of Guinea, Nkrumah of Ghana. When they went on the international scene and talked, they were heard because they had the moral authority. They had the moral strengths. I want the viewers and anybody here to tell me which African leader now has the moral authority when he goes to UN to speak. Everybody has to come and listen, or when he lands at an international airport like Heathrow or wherever, everybody, all cameras are on the African person and say, this person is from Africa and what he's going to speak is going to shake the whole world. That is at the moral level, because we don't have nuclear weapons, we don't have technology, we don't have the economy to shake the others, and in that respect, we are weak. And therefore, we need to wake up, have technological base, technological strengths, military strengths, and it will propel us into political strengths. But we could also have moral leaders.
Professor, we have 54 or 55
54 heads of state, yes.
Depending on whether you agree with Somaliland and so on. And we have very many powerful business leaders. What does it take to gain this moral strength?
Well, moral strength sometimes emerges out of the personalities. That the personalities could come up. Who brought Nyerere, and who brought Mandela, and who brought Leopold Senghor, and who brought Nkrumah, who brought Nasser.
Integrity.
You know, they had their voices, they could speak, but I think Africans could, when they are electing leaders, let them look for people who can have moral authority, soft power, if you want, soft diplomacy in themselves. Now, I said we don't have people with moral authority, we don't have technology power, we don't have economic power, we don't have nuclear power, because if we had a country with a nuclear weapon here, the world would listen. Have you seen how the whole world fears North Korea? They can't even invade them. They know they can throw back at the nuclear and all of you might be losers. But let me jump from that strengths. Can we have it? Yes. Why don't we strengthen ourselves as AU? But AU is weak, because if we had that AU strengths as a continent, the whole world, the other continents and the other countries would also listen. Unfortunately, we don't have that one. You can imagine we don't even contribute our annual subscriptions. The AU headquarters in Addis Ababa was built by, is it the Chinese? If somebody builds your house, what else do you expect? You have East African community here, which should be giving us a bargaining power. You see, once you come together, we have in my language a saying that that when you are few and you are invaded by a strong force, in order to ward off that force, you run to the banana plantation and you start shaking the sanja. And they will think you are many and you are strong, and your enemy will fear to go to come to you, and we can even run away. Now, as we are we are few and we are weak economically and technologically, so we could now use the bargaining power as a continent or as regional organizations. But what happens, I'm going to give you a very disappointing example of East African community. East African, one of the reasons why East African community was formed and why it should be there was having a strong bargaining power as East African countries. When we are bargaining with the international community or international organizations like EU. Now, we have been bargaining for a new partnership agreement because the old ones expired. They are called EPAs, Economic Partnership Agreements, with EU. So we started negotiating as East Africa. Then we started falling off. As we talk, Kenya has already signed the EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement. I think Rwanda has signed or something like that. Uganda and Tanzania are still hesitating.
As usual.
But that is not necessarily bad. The question I am talking about is now, where is now the bargaining power of East African region when you are bargaining with EU, but now you have started signing differently? Definitely you will be weak. Look at AU. AU, first of all, they will wake up and start abusing the West for interfering or whatever. Sudan is just a neighbor to AU headquarters. Everything is going wrong in Khartoum and Sudan. AU is keeping quiet. Even in Ethiopia itself, there are wars and AU is keeping quiet. When it comes to international relations, bargaining, each country almost wants to go it alone. They don't come together as a group. So it is possible that since we are few, we are few, but we can go to the banana plantation and shake the sanja and have common bargaining power. But we must strengthen our regional groupings of the AU. But AU is not as united. They are appointing the leaders whom we suspect. You find the chairman of AU is somebody who has no good governance credentials at all. One time the chairman was the president of Equatorial Guinea. The man who has been in power since 1979. The man whose vice president is the son became chairman of AU. You remember when Idi Amin was also made chairman of AU here. Now what do you expect such a continent, where such a continent can have strengths? I am glad my neighbor here was talking about students participating in national affairs. Let's leave the states now and go to students and go to citizens. You hear in America, American students, university students, as we talk, they have even forfeited examinations. They certain university, was it Columbia, whatever, had examinations.
Yes.
They forfeited the examinations.
Some have already been suspended.
But they are fighting for an international cause, the cause of the peace in Palestine. Where are Ugandans? Where are Ugandans? South Africans, I also heard them talk about that. But even if it was not a question of Palestine, there are other happenings that happen in the world, whether it is climate change or whatever. Where is Makerere University? Where is Kyambogo University? They are just keeping there in their colonial. And you expect this continent to have leadership in the future when the university students who are supposed to be knowledgeable about global affairs, about shaping global issues, they are not doing anything.
Professor,
WTO,
Professor, you're pointing at Robert from Kyambogo. I also come from Nagongara, there's also a university. Please embarrass me too.
I know there is Bustema University.
So the Nagongara campus,
The point
yes.
I am making is even when other countries, students and young people and whatever are interested in international affairs,
And that's where
they go and do something. Let me give you an example. You are asking us a question about shaping global affairs. There is WTO, World Trade Organization. It is the one which gives the rules that govern trading in the world, which normally those rules do not favor developing countries. And most developing countries feel uncomfortable with those rules. Now, they went and met in Seattle in the USA some time back. I saw American students and civil society demonstrating, being beaten against WTO because it is against Africans.
Yes.
There is a time about 10 or so years ago when the Director General of WTO came to Uganda. Not many Ugandans knew that he landed here.
Yes.
I remember a few of us from the NGO world, I was representing the NGO, we went and met him at conference center and we told him, sir, I think this is an NGO. We should have met you at the airport and made it almost hard for you to enter Kampala so that the message goes to you. There was a time that WTO held a meeting in Cancun in Mexico, and there were demonstrations.
Cancun, yes.
There was a time they held it in South Korea. I think even a certain South Korean committed suicide against the rules of the WTO. Ugandans, they just mind about their Tony Nira. How can I walk from Kampala to Kawempe or to Gayaza on foot every day is what is in their mind. They don't mind whether there should be public transport in this world. They are not bothered about what is happening in Palestine. They are not bothered about what is happening in Arusha. Today, let me tell you, Mr. Moderator, today the policies that affect us, including peasants, including agriculturists, are not necessarily made in Kampala. They are not shaped in Kampala. They are shaped in Arusha. That's the headquarters of East African Community. They are shaped in New York. That is UN. They are shaped in Washington, World Bank and the IMF. They are shaped in Geneva, the headquarters of WTO.
Paris.
They are shaped in Paris, where there is UNESCO. Yes. They are shaped in Italy. What is the capital city?
Rome.
Rome, where there is a Food and Agriculture Organization. That is where policies that shape our being here, our health, our education, our agriculture, our technology are made. Do Ugandans bother about that? They are just bothered about, I don't know, whether there is a musician who is going to come from Jamaica. There they will be, all of them will be there. They know the Jamaicans. If there is Manchester United playing against Chelsea, they know even the mother of the goalkeeper. They are not bothered. And you ask about how shall we shape the global scene when we are not bothered about the global happenings. Americans dying for Palestinians and Ugandans are sleeping up to 7 a.m. in order to go to a traffic jam. What are Ugandans doing? So we can shape global affairs in our small way. We can fight from the Sanja, but we must also know that we have the capacity to shape global affairs when we are united. But when we are disunited like this, look at Africa. That's where there are now military coups. Like it has happened in West Africa, in Congo, the other Congo, was it Congo or Gabon or whatever. We have dictatorships around. We have political parties fighting each other. We have the academia. They are only interested in research projects for their survival. We have students who only go for guild elections and kill each other. We have a disorganized society. So, to go back to my first submission is that Africa as a continent and as a people, we are not organized. We have no organizational capacity. Even if we don't have technological capacity, we could have organizational capacity. How to do this one? People must wake up, but which values do we anchor on? You see, we don't have common values that we anchor on. I have not heard AU talking about social justice, that there is no social justice, that there is no equality. You see, the French Revolution, which we normally study, which gave rise to many revolutions of the modern era in terms of good governance and capitalism.
Fraternity.
Yeah, they had three. They were very clear. They had liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yeah. And anybody who went beyond equality, liberty, and fraternity was called to order. Which idea are Ugandans or Africans anchored in? Nothing. You ask me, even me and him, we are professors. What is the idea of Africa that anchors Africans? Apart from the generality, Pan-Africanism around what?
Thank you, Professor, for that amazing submission. And indeed, Africans must find that particular thing where they anchor as Africans to be able to progress economically, socially, and politically. Gentlemen, our time is very much fast spent. We're going to conclude. We have about 5 minutes to close the show, and we shall have a round, I think, starting from Honorable Ochieno. The challenges are many, very many. The leadership, willingness, coordination, unity, Balkanization, and so on. How do we soften these up to make sure Africa progresses? Briefly.
As I said, our independence leaders, in fact, our independence leaders were amazing because not only did most of them claim the flags for various national independence, but many of them would have been participants in the quest to liberate their respective countries. I know it's unsatisfactory, but they started from somewhere. And then from there, once they predominantly gained independence, as I said, they made an effort to start somewhere, not only for their respective countries, but also now to reclaim the continent together. And I think that, as I said, is the leadership that I said which is lacking. For the moment, in conclusion, I think that with the mess that we had in the last 60 years, not only has been mess in every space, but predominantly messes, a new leadership urgently needs to emerge. And that leadership could be from the young Africans in the streets of Kampala and seeking to know that the Palestinian question is a matter of principle, that, as the professor was saying, that many of them may not necessarily know that Israel is not necessarily a Christian state. The more they did that, the more then our own we shall be respected as global citizens of the world, because we shall also be partners. The idea was that we want to seek breakfast, but it's only when it's convenient for us, but we have no clue what's happening in the neighborhood. Will not work. So yes, we need an African renaissance. Now, the idea of a renaissance where it's a building up from the NAPAD, it's a building up from the Commission for Africa equivalent, or building from the founding values of the Organization of African Unity. You notice I continuously not refer to the African Union because I think that was basically a fudged concept, is what's going to take us forward. We need to reclaim our independence and review where we are in terms of being able to foster unity, refoster and refocus on our identity and refocus on our development, but also to recognize that urgent today, amid climate change and the big youth population, most of whom are predominantly unemployed and many of whom are not skilled enough, many of whom are not educated, in fact, many of them are predominantly illiterate, that if we don't sort out our mess, in 50 years' time, we shall be almost living like the new slave market for the world. And that will be one-third of the world, the slave market. It will be a shame in 50 years' time when we're still looking back 500 years and blaming the colonists. The answer lies in our hands, and it's in you, predominantly the young population, challenging the men and women in power.
Thank you so much, Honorable Ochieno. Dr. Robert.
Yeah, I think I want to start up from where Prof began, from when we were beginning this discussion. Africa needs to know what is their comparative advantage. What advantage do we have over the European countries? For example, sometimes I get perturbed when we are wasting a lot of money that we want to make cars. How can we make cars in Uganda here? Make them using what? And even this make of cars is just assembling cars. The other day I was laughing when somebody was talking about making bulbs, and the trader now who really makes this bulb came on radio and said, we don't make bulbs. We assemble bulbs. We don't have ability to make bulbs. So we should not waste time on things where we don't have comparative advantage. If we are making something, let's talk about making. If we are assembling is not bad. For example, you will find that many of these countries like China, they are also assembling grounds. You find that the technology is from Belgium, but they are assembling in China. And they know themselves as assemblers. That is the first thing. The second thing, we need to improve on our type of leaders that we have. Most of our leaders really are funny. For example, this talk came from the Nairobi conference, and the biggest speaker there was our president, Yoweri Museveni, who instead used the opportunity to lambast Africans and Ugandans in particular by saying that they are lazy. And I thank you, Spire. Spire today came up with a photo where a certain man is carrying the president, and the president is keeping to tell him, don't be lazy. And this man is carrying the president walking around with him. So that means that it is the poor people whom they are calling lazy who are making Museveni to move in a convoy of 50, live like as if he's a parish king in Entebbe, and enjoy his family. These days, their birthdays there. Every weekend, their birthdays. They don't care about the children who are dying. Finally, Africa needs to improve on their trade, both internally and externally. And for you to trade, you must produce. I've been talking about this daily. We must produce, and producing for where we have to add value to improve on our GDP. And so those statistics don't lie. Countries with the poor GDPs have a lot of problems. So I think once you know your comparative advantage, you get right leaders, and you are producing for the market, we shall be there. We may not beat the Western world, but we need to see where we can have some comparative advantage with them.
Thank you so much, Doctor. And finally, Mr. Final word on the show. How do we get out of the mess we are in?
Yeah.
Briefly, in a minute.
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing me to be here and contribute to these discussions. Ultimately, all these issues that we've been bringing up always lead to almost the same issues that we have to find a way of dealing with. When I started, I was giving us the what Africa was, then how it has come to be what it is today. To finalize on that, before we see what we can do today, is to appreciate that Africa was introduced into the international system after the desecration of the continent at the ground level in the international value chain. We were introduced at the lowest level to supply raw materials. That was our role. That's what the Balkanization and all the systematic processes that went about breaking us up were to achieve, to be able to introduce us into the international value chain system at the lowest level. That's where we've operated. That's what we've always talked of, poor terms of trade. That's what we've talked of, all divisions on the continent, and the lack of infrastructure to bring us all together as one entity. I'll just talk about one item that will allow us to appreciate what we can do to try to reverse this.
Yes, briefly.
And that's coffee. When we talk of coffee, coffee was introduced here in Uganda. I will talk of coffee and in Uganda in particular. It was introduced in Uganda as a product that we were to supply to the international value chain system. We have produced coffee, we've grown volumes of coffee, we've done a lot about coffee, but we've always retained poor terms of trade as far as coffee is concerned. Everyone argues, and we now start talking of adding value to it. That won't change a thing. Why? Because we were constituted to be suppliers of the beans as raw materials to be introduced in the value chain system. Right now, the value chain controllers of coffee in Uganda export almost 90% of Uganda's coffee today. The ones who control the value chain in which we were introduced export more than 90% of our coffee beans today. People will hear names like Chagalanyi, not appreciating that it's part of the international value chain system who control the value chain. And we can only ever participate as producers of that bean for their value system. You have Volcafi, that Chagalanyi supplies to, they control the value chain system. We have Olam, that one is from, you have Olam that is controlled in Singapore. It has its headquarters and it has all the way to the villages in Uganda also exporting coffee from here. You have Ibero. It's an international value chain controller of coffee. It's all the way to the villages in Uganda, to the lowest farmer, and they all export coffee from Uganda today. You have Louis Dreyfus. These are all big international players in coffee. And all of them export beans from the continent, and then whichever other player does independent supplies to them or their players because they control the rest of the value chain. Now, when you say you want to add value to beans that you yourself don't control, probably you control less than 10% as a country, there's no change you'll make to your participation in this value chain. That's the first thing.
We shall never get out of wealth.
We have to localize the value chain so that, like Singapore did, it was one of the players, it came and bought Olam, which is one of the international value chain systems, and it's an owner of that part of the value chain, that it can control the beans to the final product cup of coffee on the markets in the international community. We don't do that.
Thank you, Mr. Wanda, Wotsomu, for that amazing submission. And ultimately, I guess we should buy all these companies and make them Ugandan.
UPC did, was able to solve them off.
Thank you. Professor, I think you want to say.
Thank you. I wanted just to make something very brief that we must be very clear about the African agenda. We shall continue having all these lamentations unless we have a clear agenda and we work towards achieving that, the goals of that agenda. And to me, they are these two. First, we must aim at having a technological base in Africa and many African countries. That's one. And we can work on that. We can organize education, we can organize research, we can organize these new, they call them innovation hubs, and have a technological base. Two, another agenda we should have organizational capacity, whether at the farm level, whether at the national level, whether at the regional level and continental level. We must have organizational capacity. I participated in introducing a course in Makerere University called Organizational Studies. It has been limping. They almost want to scrap it, but it has been limping and they have not given it publicity. To me, the problem of Africa is disorganization. We need to have organizational capacity at all these levels. Once we are organized with a technological base, then we shall have space on the world scene. Otherwise, we shall remain a laughing stock on the world continent.
Thank
On
you
the
so-
world, sorry,
Thank
on the
you
world
so
scene.
much, Professor. We need to create a technology base and we need to get organized as a continent so as to compete with the
At
rest
the
of
global
the world.
level.
Thank you, Honorable Ochieno Joseph, for being with us today and for the amazing submissions. Professor Mwabutsya Ndebesa, thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Dr.Robert, thank you so much for joining us today. And Mr. Wanda Wotsomu, thank you so much for being with us. Getting that name really.
Thank you for that pronunciation. Perfect.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for being in the Citizens Chat Show. This is Civic Space TV and I am Phillip. Remember, this is made possible by the Center for Constitutional Governance. Special thanks to the people behind the machines. Well done, a couple of ladies there and gentlemen. And from us, we say good evening and may you have freedom always.